Constitution is a document consistently under attack by parties whose political motivations persuade their feelings about individual items within the contract between the people and the government. Perhaps no element has been more under assault than the Electoral College. This strange and seemingly antiquated way of selecting a president feels disconnected from the will of the people. Over and over, frustrated citizens whose candidate for president doesn't secure the votes within the system call for its abolishment. They insist that an election by direct democracy, primarily by means of the popular vote, is a much more desirable method of selecting a person for the presidency. This level of frustration has especially come to light in recent memory because of the elections of 2000 and 2016. In both instances, the losing candidate had the most votes in the popular count, but ultimately failed to prevail in the Electoral College. While this isn't unique to the American experience, it is most fresh in our memories, and one that caused the losing side a great deal of frustration and discussions around its removal as the methodology of selection. The founders created the system as a compromise during the Constitutional Convention, as a way for less populated states to have a say in who is elected president. It gives smaller, less populated states like Vermont and Wyoming a weighted voice in the overall picture of the election. While it may be misunderstood, it has much more to do with how the founders saw each individual state when the convention was convened. On the heels of a Revolutionary War and having attempted a loose confederacy between the states, the founders saw their own states as autonomous countries whose voice needed to be heard in the collective union, but who insisted upon maintaining their own individual statehoods. Some insist today that it is a remnant from the southern states who wanted to make sure that they were represented based on the holding of slaves and their lack of population, and so it should be eliminated. Others feel its abolishment is necessary because the states are far more connected as one country than they are as individual autonomous entities in our modern era. Regardless of one's opinion about it, the mechanism has a subtle brilliance that might just be the pathway out of the two-party duopoly. The fundamentals of the Electoral College are based upon the census. Every 10 years, the federal government is charged with the counting of the people in the nation, and then after the data is collected, assigning apportioned representation upon the discovered numbers. The total number of votes per state for the Electoral College are a combination of the number of House districts and the number of senators. This provision comes from Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution, and describes a body of people who stand as electors outside of the system. They are secured typically by the candidate or the parties, and after the general public cast their vote for president, the electors are bound and vote at the State House for the winning candidate. Each candidate has their own set of electors that would cast an in-person vote at the House for their candidate if he or she won the state. For example, when Bill Clinton won Arkansas, his slate of electors traveled to Little Rock and cast their vote for Mr. Clinton. Had George H.W. Bush won Arkansas, his slate of electors would have then been the ones voting. After the electors vote, that is then turned into the House of Representatives and the Senate for their counting. The election is certified by the President of the Senate, the current and sitting Vice President. It sounds confusing, but it's all been described in detail in the Constitution, and it's been the process nearly unchanged since the beginning. Contrary to the media presentation and what our education system describes as our form of government, the popular vote and direct democracy have no relevance upon the selection of president. There is no provision in the Constitution in which it is described that the popular vote should be taken into account on the national level. This system was always intended to give the states a strong and unique voice in the election of the single person who presides over the executive branch of government. In fact, one of the primary arguments in the Anti-Federalist Papers that the college helped to address was a fear that the presidency would evolve into a monarchical position if it were strictly based upon popularity and the dominance of the large populations in the largest states. The majority vote is simply made up by the press in order to create the illusion of a horse race. The Electoral College was proposed near the end of the convention by the Committee on Unfinished Parts, chaired by David Brearley of New Jersey, to provide a system that would select the most qualified president and vice president. Historians have suggested a variety of reasons for the adoption of the Electoral College, including concerns about the separation of powers and the relationship between the executive and legislative branches, the balance between small and large states, slavery, and the perceived dangers of direct democracy. One supporter of the Electoral College, Alexander Hamilton, argued that while it might not be perfect, it was at least excellent. Through most of the 19th century, the Electoral College was utilized and empowered in ways unfamiliar to our modern mindset. John Quincy Adams, the sixth president of the United States, was actually the Electoral College's choice of compromise in an election that ultimately did not meet the requirements for the selection of president by the Electoral College in the Constitution. This provision that requires the majority of the electors was intended, and for much of our history utilized, as a way in which the presidency stood outside of direct democracy. That may raise frustration and ire to our current beliefs about how elections in the United States work, but the historic reality of this institution is that it has been used much for the better than it has for the harm. The election of 1824 is one that should be understood in the context of the election of 2024. Ultimately, upon this 200-year anniversary of that election, we may be facing a similar discussion. In 1824, there were four major presidential candidates: Andrew Jackson, John Quincy Adams, Henry Clay, and William Crawford. When the votes were tallied, no candidate had secured a majority of electoral votes. Andrew Jackson had the most with 99, but because of the other three candidates all securing similar numbers of electors, the election was then tossed to the House of Representatives, as described by the 12th Amendment, for them to decide who the president would be. The Congress, which was, and still is today, seated before the certification of the Electoral College vote, took up an argument on who should be president based upon the top three finishers. In 1824, Jackson, Adams, and Crawford were the top three vote getters, so the campaign by those candidates amongst the representatives in Congress began. In this provision of the Constitution, the vote in a contested election is described as one vote per state. Each state's representatives gather and decide who they, as a singular voice, would choose for the president. In the election of 1824, Adams, who had been a political staple in Washington and the last connection to the founding generation, campaigned amongst his peers and secured 13 states to Jackson's 7 and Crawford's 4. Adams was elected on the first ballot of that contested election and became the president. History has a funny way of repeating itself, and in 2024 we find ourselves in a similar position as the country did in 1824. Two major parties have secured their presumptive nominees through their coronation-style primary process, and both Joe Biden and Donald Trump are proceeding forward in their run for the presidency in this election. However, Robert Kennedy Jr. continues to show signs of polling strength, and his volunteers are securing his position on state ballots all across this country. As America doubles down on terrible candidate after terrible candidate in election after election, both President Trump and President Biden are highly unlikable figures who have seemingly outpaced the field to define the phrase, the lesser of two evils. Biden's failing health and political missteps on foreign policy, the border, and his appearance as puppet frontman by the bureaucratic state leave many from his party questioning his validity. Donald Trump lost favor amongst his base with his response to COVID, his failure to fulfill campaign promises about the border, China, and many other things unsavory to conservatives. Both are entering the fall campaign season in weak positions as compared to traditional party candidates. Unlike other elections in the past in which a third-party candidate plays the role of spoiler for one person in the election, RFK Jr. is securing votes and support from disenfranchised citizens from both major political parties. This ultimately could have massive impacts upon the Electoral College come November. If Kennedy continues to garner financial support and his poll numbers continue to grow, there is a good chance that in many swing states, Kennedy becomes a viable choice and may very well win multiple states and secure their Electoral College votes. Mr. Kennedy has insisted that he is in the election to win it outright, and given his dedication and tireless work, he very well could. After all, in a three-way race, it only requires 34% of any state's votes to secure all electors from those states that are winner-take-all, which is every state but Maine and Nebraska. If things break correctly for Mr. Kennedy, and the country does express its fatigue with both Presidents Trump and Biden, there is a path to victory for RFK Jr. For party diehards, this is likely a nightmare scenario, but for the rest of us in this country, this disruption may be the very thing we need to break apart a long-standing tradition in the two-party system. In the event that no one secures the majority of electoral votes, the House of Representatives would choose the president. The House, who is constituted of the winners of November's elections, would convene to vote for the presidency. Each state would get one single vote to decide who they prefer for president. Mr. Kennedy becomes a very plausible option for many states who are split in their representation, or states who ultimately have selected Mr. Kennedy during the general election. That bodes well for his chances at securing the office. Mr. Kennedy would have to win a majority of that vote in Congress, and given the turmoil of a three-person race, That is not an unimaginable outcome. At this moment in our history, it may just be what we need. Our anger and division feels more palpable than at any time in recent memory. The citizens have become coerced to believing that their party's nominees are the only saviors of democracy from the other side. The partisans believe that the election of the other party's candidate is the last step into fascism or dictatorship. If we are in a contested moment, the representatives may see that Robert Kennedy Jr. gives them a relief valve to this logical fallacy. Fear may very well be the motivator that shows up in the ballot box in November. If it does, and Mr. Kennedy does not fully secure a victory on the majority, there is a likelihood that a contested election will become the pathway to the presidency based upon the constitutional provisions. That may initially cause a great deal of concern and consternation, but with a few steps back from the vitriol of what is certain to be a nasty election cycle, Mr. Kennedy rises to the surface as the sane and rational voice in an irrational time.